My degree is in art and design. I went to art school originally, was more of a visual artist, and I was earning my living as a graphic designer and as an art director. And when you're working for clients all day, as a result of that, I wanted to have a creative space unrelated to my day job, and so I began writing fiction. And eventually, I just enjoyed the process of writing fiction that I wanted to spend more and more time doing that. Started going to writers' conferences and trying to get better and meet with editors and try to find my voice as an author. Um, I tend to, like right now, I'm traveling so much for a book tour that I don't have any time to write. I have to fly to Florida tomorrow. But when I'm really writing, I write every single day. And I write from about 7 in the morning to maybe 1 in the afternoon. Then I edit what I was working on. I try to stop midstream so that the next day I'm eagerly waiting to jump back into the story. And I write 7 days a week. I think you do have to be a reader first. I don't know any successful author that isn't also a very passionate reader. I think they go hand in hand. One is connected to the other. Um, but what you read can be really different than what you write. I've met lots of authors who they write science fiction, but all they read are chick lit, or they write gothic fantasy, but all they read are historical romance, or they read something different than what they write. I see that a lot. Some of my favorite authors are contemporary author would be Sherman Alexie. Also, I like Pat Conroy. Ever since I was a little kid, he haunted my imagination. Harlan Ellison. Big fan of Harlan Ellison. Even though my writing is nothing like his, I like his voice, and I'm always entertained by. The U.S. is really in flux. There's lots of change right now. The two major publishers, Random House and Penguin, have merged. Ebooks, probably half of all the book sales are now ebooks. Depending on the genre, some of the sales are all the way up to 70–80% of the sales are ebooks. It's been sad for me because ebooks. I don't have a problem with ebooks, but what they do is they put bookstores out of business, and so there's lots of independent bookstores that are like friends and family to me, and to see those stores go away is kind of heartbreaking. So I'm not a big fan of Amazon, which is the big bad wolf over here. One thing we like about the European markets is there isn't such a predatory publishing entity like Amazon. My experience with Random House has been great. With traditional publishing, with readers in the U.S. has been fabulous. And one of the times that I've gone to Europe, like to Frankfurt, I've gone to Oslo for book festivals in Norway, has been phenomenal. So I'm really looking forward to. I've been touring for 8 weeks in the U.S., which has been great, but I'm really looking forward to going overseas. I always with with aspiring writers, I always t- two different types of advice. One is allow yourself to not be so good for a while. I mean, so many times people sit down. Think of it like a musical instrument. You wouldn't sit down to play the piano and expect to play Mozart right away. And a lot of times when it comes to writing, people sit down and they try to write this fantastic novel right away, and they don't practice enough. They don't give themselves a margin for improvement, and then they get very discouraged. So I always tell people, allow yourself to kind of just stink for a while. It's okay. Allow yourself to suck. It's okay. But also, Another bit of advice is to, if you have your very favorite author in the world whose prose you just love, maybe not read that while you're trying to write. It's like trying to lose weight or diet and only reading beauty magazines. You die a death of comparison. And so if you take a break from that, you might be less frustrated. I knew I wanted to write about the Depression in Seattle because that's when my grandparents met. My Chinese grandparents met in a backroom gambling parlor in Chinatown in 1928. They met at a place called the Wami Club. My grandmother was a coat check girl, and my grandfather was a blackjack dealer. And I just really liked that time period. There was lots of this confluence of ethnicities and economic calamity and all of these things that were going on in the U.S. at the time were really interesting, especially for someone that was not Caucasian, not white. And in America, before Las Vegas, before you had a place where you could go, like Las Vegas, if you wanted. This is during Prohibition in the U.S., so alcohol was illegal. So if you wanted booze, if you wanted gambling, if you wanted live music or other kinds of illegal fun, you went to places like Chinatown, and that's where my grandparents met. So the story really began with that time period and exploring what the landscape was like and what some of the obstacles Chinese people faced, especially Chinese American women. Yeah, I did. I really, when I was doing research, I didn't realize um, that at that time period that there were film studios in places other than Hollywood. We think of the film industry in the U.S. and it's very Hollywood centric. It's all in California, but back then there were studios all over the place, including the H.C. Weaver studio, which was in Tacoma, Washington, which was a huge studio at the time. Now it all burned to the ground and there's nothing of it remains. Um, but also not just the movie industry as far as production, but before television, before the internet, when you had so many grand movie palaces where people would go, they would dress up and they'd go see a silent film, and there'd be a full orchestra who played the music live. Now everything is processed and everything is so far removed from the actual art. I love the time of working musicians. We've sort of lost that. In Seattle at the time, there were 80 big movie theaters, these grand movie palaces, and only a few of them remain. They've been turned into department stores or office buildings and things like that. So I like the time period when uh, more was made out of movies. Movies were special, and they weren't cranked out quite so quickly with the intention of just making sequels and remakes, and I think Hollywood today is kind of broken in that way. The passing of my parents, yes. Um, yeah, I lost both my parents when I was probably 30, 31 years old. So all of my books have come out after in the years after all of that. Yeah, I lost my grandparents and my parents some time ago, and uh, before that, I had been trying to write a different novel. Had finished another novel that was not published. Was a contemporary novel. Didn't have multi ethnic characters. Wasn't historical. Was kind of a boring literary novel. I don't even know what it was about, but it was what I thought I was supposed to write at the time. And once I found that once my parents had passed away, that I had an emotional well to draw upon. I finally had something to write about. And once all those doors were closed, I had lots of questions about the time period in which they lived in, how they met, which I think is natural. If you lose family, you wonder about things that you never had an opportunity to ask, and so that led to more historical research. And then I enjoyed writing about those time periods, the time periods of my dad or my grandfather. Yeah, Willow. Uh, a little bit of my mother, a little bit of my Chinese grandmother, and a nod to the real silent film star Anna May Wong. My mom and my grandmother were both alpha females. They're very strong women at a time when, especially my grandmother. My grandmother had a child out of wedlock in 1929, and she's a Chinese American woman, so she was like a minority within a minority within a minority where um, there was a lot of prejudice and judgment on the type of person she was, and she grew up to be a very strong woman, but she had a very rough childhood. And so it is a bit of a nod towards that. But also Anna May Wong. I was always fascinated by Anna May Wong because she was too American for a Chinese husband, and yet she dated Caucasian men, often in the film industry, but she could never marry them because there were laws against Chinese and white intermarrying. And so she really was this tragic character that over the course of her lifetime, she had success, but the success didn't ever equal happiness. Like, I wanted a character um, that was sightless, that was blind, but that had a real depth of feeling. That a character that wouldn't see color, wouldn't see prejudice, wouldn't see people for their skin color, would just see people for who they really were. So someone that was blind, that saw the world in a different way, that didn't see all the poverty around her. But also Charlotte. Um, I like the idea of having the blind girl there because Mother Cabrini, who was the nun that started this orphanage, was canonized as a saint, and one of the miracles attributed to her was curing a blind girl, and she did that at Sacred Heart. Sure. Um, yeah, I mean, good or bad, we're still connected to our parents. Unfortunately, we don't get to choose our parents, and so sometimes we're stuck with parents who are terrible, or poor parents, or poor examples. Um, but it doesn't have to define who we are. It can be a reflection of who we are, but it doesn't have to be. A reflection of who we are isn't the same as the actual personage. I do. The book is definitely about love between parent and child, about abandonment, and about the decisions that we make to create that abandonment or to reconcile that abandonment. I think William and Willow, there is a bond there, but there's other situations of Willow and her mother, or Charlotte and her father. Um, and so I think unconditional. We would like it to be unconditional, but sometimes I think there are circumstances that are so horrific that it's hard for it to be unconditional. Hmm. My favorite character is probably Charlotte. Um, I think she's braver than William, um, even though she has more challenges in life and has had probably a more difficult childhood. I think she's more admirable because of that, and because of how the story ends for her. She's definitely a character. I write characters and I tend to think of them as having immortal souls, like they're still existing, like Henry and Keiko in Hotel on the corner of Bitter and Sweet. I still think of them as characters doing something somewhere, but because Charlotte, her story ends in that book, I miss her the most. I write in drag. I wear women's clothing when I write. I'm joking, of course. Um, um, no, I think writers put themselves in a lot of different characters. Whether if you write science fiction, you're going to have to put yourself on another world. If you write a Western, you're going to have to put yourself in a different environment. And I think writing female characters isn't that difficult. I wouldn't imagine it would be that difficult for a woman to write a male character. I think you have to have a sensitivity, perhaps, but imagination can go a long way. Oh, it's like finishing the last mile of a marathon. You know, you're tired but happy. Um, with this book especially because it was my second novel, there was a lot of pressure, and so I was very happy to be done with it and to it feels like giving birth, you know, and then that I had been in labor for about 30 hours, and you're finally just ready to push and see what happens at that point. Um, with this book, at the end of the book, I think there's a new story beginning, and I was happy with that ending. So far, it's been good in the U.S. I think I think the new book is a little bit darker. I shouldn't say I think it is a bit darker than Hotel, and so it has a different flavor to it, a different taste to it. But it debuted on the bestseller list. It seems to be selling better than Hotel. Um, there's a lot of interesting. There's a lot of people that have never read Hotel that have read this book first now, and so it's kind of interesting to have a new audience, some overlap with the old audience, but also to have a new audience. As far as good reviews, bad reviews, I don't read them because I always feel like they're not written for the author. They're written peer to peer from one person to another person, and so it feels like I'm reading someone's journal or their diary by looking at reviews. They tend to make me feel too happy or too sad, and there's really nothing I can do about it but write the kind of book that I want to write, and that works for me. It's interesting because in the US right now, it seems like there's an audience for multicultural fiction. So for years growing up, I didn't feel Chinese enough, or I didn't feel Caucasian enough. My dad spoke Cantonese fluently, but I didn't, so I always felt like I was different from the rest of my Chinese family. But now it feels good because there's such interest in multicultural stories. What I perceived as a weakness for so long is now a bit of a strength. But I still get frustrated because I've had lots of offers to turn Hotel into a movie, but they always want to make one of my characters white. They want to make Keiko or Henry white, which makes me feel accepted because the book's done so well, and then it makes me feel rejected because Hollywood still can't understand how to make a movie with something other than white characters. Yeah, thank you for being here. I appreciate that. I I wrote this book to be a little more heartbreaking than Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Um, I should learn to say the Italian title. I keep forgetting that. But I'll have that figured out by the time I get to Milan, I promise. Um, but I- it's my goal to write books that break your heart, but it's also my promise that if I ever break your heart, it's also my goal to put the pieces back together again, and hopefully in better working condition. Thank you.